Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Phil 101 material. This is a continuation of our discussion of epistemology and a topic that has, I think, so many interesting aspects to it and couldn't be more relevant to the current climate of the United States, in my view. So that is the topic of truth. And it's certainly something that philosophers have thought long and hard about for millennia. And there are a number of really interesting views that are outlined in the reading and in this lecture. So as always, I do want to recommend that you have a go at reading the assigned journal article before listening to the lecture. I know that this article in particular was perhaps a little less accessible than others were, but nonetheless, so long as we understand the general facets and views of the respective answers to what is truth, I think we'll be all right. So we'll get started. So one thing that we want to start off by talking about is what's called the principle problem. This is a problem related to metaphysics and epistemology, so a continuation from last week. Then we'll talk about truth and falsity, and then go over very briefly the major theories of truth that have dominated most Western discussions of truth. One thing that I want to point out here is that there are other notions of truth that are not covered in this reading and in this lecture that might be more applicable to some philosophers from Asia and even indigenous philosophy. But because of space constraints, we are only going to talk about some of the more major Western conceptions, but that isn't to say that there aren't others, and that that omission is not meant to be a signifier that other views aren't as plausible, but that we want to talk about some of the more major influential theories that have been discussed, especially in the last few hundred years. And then we'll talk about some other related issues. Okay, so recall that in the last section, we talked about the infamous JTB account of knowledge, which is justified true belief. So in that lecture and reading, we talked about epistemology generally, and we talked about what it means to have knowledge, right? So we asked, what do we mean when we say we know something? Like, I know my friend Tom is sitting next to me. Or in formal terms, what does I know that P mean? Traditionally, as we said in the JTB account, it means three things. We believe that P, our belief in P has to be justified, warranted, or backed up by sufficient evidence, and our belief in P has to be true. So is that the end of the story? Well, we saw that there are lots of potential criticisms, specifically Gettier cases to the JTB account, and then some various solutions for how to repair it. And there's obviously significant philosophical disagreement on whether the JTB account can be rescued, but it's still nonetheless a very popular view about knowledge. Does knowledge involve something more? Okay. So let's think about this with a case. So suppose that John has never made a mistake. Today, he plans to buy some low-fat milk at the store. By mistake, he incorrectly tells his friend Sam that he intends to buy whole milk. Later, when John goes to the store, still planning to buy low-fat milk, he accidentally picks up a container of whole milk. Not realizing his mistake, he pays for the milk and leaves the store. Does Sam know what kind of milk John bought at the store, right? So this gets at the heart of these Gettier cases that we talked about. So hopefully, just to refresh, in epistemology, we really want to figure out what are the conditions for knowledge. Because in cases like this, again, it seems this should remind you of the clock example. There really seem to be a lot of issues with what kind of conditions need to be there for someone to claim to have knowledge, right? And that's part of the challenge. That's why epistemology is such can often be a dense and complicated affair, because obviously reasonable people are going to disagree on what counts for knowledge. okay? So we could say if Sam were asked whether he knows this, he would say that he knows that John bought whole milk because Sam is indeed justified. It also is true, though by accident, that John bought whole milk. So Sam has a justified true belief, right? So again, Gettier problem. So these kinds of discussions feed into quite nicely, well, what is truth? Because it seems like when we talk about knowledge, it's hard not to talk about truth and things like facts. So what's the relationship between knowledge and truth? I mean, that's a big set of questions, I know, and we're not even beginning to scratch the surface, but hopefully right away, it should be clear that our notions of knowledge are inexorably tied up with notions of truth, right? In different situations in real life, we seem to believe truth means different things and perhaps can be established in different ways. So truth could be what gets us what we want, what fits with our other beliefs and meanings, and what corresponds with what is out there in the real world. So obviously, if you've noticed, especially in online conversations, what counts for truth has dramatically, I think it's safe to say, changed based on a number of factors, whether it's confirmation bias, some psychological factors. There's so much more we could say here, but notions of truth have certainly changed, and one might argue changed quite dramatically in the last 20 or so years with the rise of the internet, right? So it depends on who you ask, and we're going to look at a couple different answers to the question, what is truth? And most of the notions of truth that we'll get are going to fall into or match up with 1, 2, or 3, and they're going to give us different answers. So maybe it would be helpful to pause here and think to yourself, well, what is truth? What do you think truth is? Does 1 sound promising? Does 2 sound promising? Or 3 sound promising? Or if none of those 3, what do you think truth is? It's a age-old question, and hopefully you've thought about it before, but we'll get into the details. Okay, so as I mentioned, there have been 3 primary theories of truth that line up with the 3 points that we just had on the previous slide that are covered in this article. There's others, but we'll focus on 3 of them. The pragmatic theory of truth. So the pragmatic theory says that our beliefs are true when they work. That is, when they get us what we want. So that might sound a little oversimplified, but a lot of people seem to have the idea that, well, what's true is what works, right? So if it works, if it gives us something that gets us results, that's all we mean by true. So that's one approach that we'll talk about. Another approach is called coherence theory. And the coherence theory says that a belief is true when it fits with our other beliefs and meanings. In other words, when a belief coheres with the other pieces of knowledge that we have. And the third one, which I think it's safe to say has been the most widely shared and intuitive view of truth, is what's called the correspondence theory. So the correspondence theory of truth says that a belief is true when it corresponds with what is out there in the real world, right? That there is an external world, an objective reality. So if I say that it's true that Earth is the 3rd planet from the sun, well, it corresponds with the nature of the external solar system, right? Of which we're a part, but there's actually a planet that's external to just me called Earth that is really the 3rd planet from our sun's, our solar system's star, right? So correspondence theory, very plausible. A lot of people like it, but hopefully you see here, these 3 theories are quite different. So if your first inclination is to say, oh, well, they're all true, well, that can't be right because these 3 theories are not consistent. There might be some overlap, but it's important to notice that they say fundamentally different things. So we'll see by the end whether any of these views appeal to you. Okay, there's additional theories of truth that have become increasingly popular, especially even recently. And I think relativism is certainly at the top of that list. Relativism has a long history, but I mean, not to be too anecdotal here, but I've certainly noticed the rise of people who are relativists, especially in, I would say, the last 10 years. And if you're a relativist, you think all truth is relative. Whether a statement is true just depends on who makes the statement. So it might be that what's true for you isn't true for me, right? Things like that. One thing we should point out, though, is that sometimes the word truth is used quite loosely, okay? Because sometimes people use truth to describe their belief or opinion, right? So if I said Thai food is my favorite food, and then you said Italian food is my favorite, well, what's true for me isn't true for you. Then it seems like we're using truth the same way that we're using the word opinion or belief, right? Because as we talked about last week, beliefs aren't knowledge necessarily, right? So we have to be clear about the language that we're using. But suffice it to say, relativism has become, I think, a very popular view, especially with the rise of alternative news sources and how people see the world pretty differently, right? So even taking scientific knowledge as an example, if I said it's true that hydrogen has 1 proton, and somebody else said, well, that's not true for me. Hydrogen has 7 protons. A lot of people think, well, one person is no more right than the other. A lot of other people, though, myself included, are inclined to say, well, that just can't be right. I mean, are we really talking about 2 different realities? Relativism, while potentially well-intentioned, doesn't seem to capture the shared sense of human experience. I mean, yes, there are disagreements about which food is better and which bands are better, but relativism is making a stronger claim. I want it to be clear from the onset. I mean, relativism is the view that if you're having a conversation with somebody who thinks that the earth is flat and you say, no, it's round, if relativism is true, then you're both right. And that just doesn't seem to capture our intuition about that experience, right? I think most of us want to say, no, the person who says that the earth is flat, they're just wrong, right? They can believe that the earth is flat, but it's not flat. So it can't be true. They might think it's true, but they're just mistaken, right? So a lot of us, I think, have the intuition that knowledge and truth capture more than just people's opinions and beliefs, right? People have beliefs and opinions that are wrong or mistaken, and that's okay, right? We're humans. But if you're a relativist, which is fine, no judgment, you're going to have to answer for some cases like that where, how could they both be right? I mean, it seems like quite clearly and intuitively that one person's wrong, right? If they or take math, maybe that's a better example. If somebody says 2 + 2 = 5, and they say, well, that's true for me, and you say, no, 2 + 2 = 4, if relativism is true, then you're both right. I mean, and that just seems really counterintuitive to a lot of people, myself included. So relativism, though, is certainly a common view, and a lot of people like it. It is related to something that's mentioned in the reading, which is called postmodernism. Postmodernist views of truth have certainly become influential, I would say, in the last 100 years or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. And according to postmodernist views of truth, which we won't really cover here, there's really no such thing as the truth about any non-trivial claims. So according to this view, truth is sociologically constructed and nothing more. So even scientific truths are sociologically constructed. It's not relativism, but postmodernism does share some intuitions with relativism, it's safe to say. But we won't spend too much time on these views. Okay, so we'll begin by looking at some of the more common views. Okay, so let's talk about correspondence theory. So the most popular theory of truth is the correspondence theory, which says that truth is an agreement, or hence correspondence, between a proposition and some fact in the real world. So the statement, I'm typing on the computer, even right now, is true if and only if I'm actually, in fact, typing on the computer that's external to me, that exists in the real world. So this theory assumes that there is a real world, as I said, of facts whose existence does not depend on your beliefs, thoughts, or perceptions, and to which our statements can correspond. So in other words, if there was no computer in front of me, then I wouldn't be typing, right? There is an actual computer sitting there external to my mind that I'm typing on, giving me the perception that I'm typing on the computer. Okay, so correspondence theory essentially says that truth is that relationship or correspondence between a proposition and some fact about the real world. Pretty intuitive. One of correspondence theory's biggest defenders was someone we've already seen, Bertrand Russell. Russell claims that the truth or falsity of a belief does not depend on the nature of the belief itself, but on something outside of the belief. As we said before, the actual computer. So according to Russell's view of correspondence theory, truth is a relationship between the belief and things in the world outside the belief. So it's not enough for me to think I'm typing on the computer because maybe I'm dreaming, right? Think of Descartes. Or maybe I'm hallucinating or ate some bad food or something. There actually has to be, for it to be truth, an actual computer in front of me. I can't just believe that I'm typing on a computer to think that it's true that I'm typing on the computer. In other words, truth is a correspondence between belief and fact, according to this view. So what does correspondence mean? So Russell offers an account of what he means by correspondence. That is, what it means to say that a belief corresponds to a fact. He argues that a belief corresponds with the facts when its objects or object terms corresponds to the order of facts in the world. So essentially a one-to-one relationship, a very intuitive account for a lot of people. So Russell calls the constituents or parts of a belief its objects or object terms, like, again, the computer, or the cat is sitting next to my computer. So in the belief that John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln, the objects are Booth, shot, and Lincoln, right? So the facts or truth about that correspond to those objects that are just mentioned. So here's I think a revealing quote from him. He says, "We may restate our theory as follows. If we take such a belief as Othello believes that Desdemona loves Cassio, we will call Desdemona and Cassio the object terms and loving the object relation. If there is a complex unity, Desdemona's love for Cassio consisting of the object terms related by the object relation in the same order as they have in the belief, then this complex unity is called the fact corresponding to the belief. Thus, a belief is true when there is a corresponding fact and is false when there is no corresponding fact." So if we take the example of the flat earth, right? Somebody might have the belief that the earth is flat, but there is no corresponding fact to that belief, Russell would say. Someone can believe the earth is flat all day long, but there's no fact that corresponds to that, so it can't be truth. Now, are there problems with this view? Of course, right? It's philosophy. So if we assume that the objects of a belief are more or less equivalent to the words of the sentence that expresses the belief or the truth that expresses the belief, it's unclear whether it makes good sense to talk about correspondence. Because words are related to one another in a quite different way from facts and events in the world. How can the people, whether they're Greek figures or Roman figures or whomever, be related to each other in the same way that words are related to each other? So in other words, what really is corresponding about the words to the objects in the world? Because words make sense because we've constructed them, right? We've created languages. So what is that correspondence from an object to a fact? What does that look like, right? Because it seems like the correspondence theorists are arguing that, yeah, there's something about the earth being round that connects to the belief, but beliefs are about language, right? Or about propositions. So what's that correspondence look like? That's really the ultimate question here. This doesn't mean that correspondence theory is fatally doomed. It's a question about, well, what is that correspondence really about? Can you tell us some more about that? And so correspondence theorists have tried to respond to this in a number of different ways. Russell seems to be assuming, like a lot of correspondence theorists, that beliefs or sentences are like pictures. So when I say that the earth is round, or when I say that it's true that Mars is the fourth planet from the sun, essentially what I'm doing is I'm giving a picture of an accurate representation of a scene when the parts of the picture are related to each other in the same way that the parts of the scene are related to each other. So I'm essentially giving you a snapshot of my belief. That's the analogy he wants to draw. Similarly, a belief is true when its parts are related to each other in the same way that the parts of the corresponding fact are related to each other. So, just again, simple example, if you go hiking in Mount Rainier, which I would recommend, it's beautiful. Maybe when the weather gets nice, when I take a picture of Mount Rainier, right, the picture is a representation of the mountain, right? And hopefully us hiking. But we have to wonder, though, as philosophers, whether that is an accurate depiction of the way we acquire knowledge and truth, right? Because a lot of people might say, but those things aren't analogous. Me taking a picture of Mount Rainier is not analogous to me talking about the truths of the universe, right? So we might say the whole trouble with this approach is that beliefs and sentences are not like pictures of things. They are not even remotely like pictures. So the analogy doesn't hold. One other serious shortcoming of the correspondence theory is it assumes we are able to determine when our beliefs match a reality that is external to ourselves, right? A lot of people might point out here that we never have direct access to an external world. I can't get outside of my mind to go check something, right? It's not like we have that kind of God's eye view of the world. So do we really have ways of checking the correspondence? Our only access to an external world is through the information our senses provide. Thus, the criticism goes, we have no way of knowing whether that information is accurate because we cannot get beyond our senses to check out the external world. Another criticism centers on the notion of fact, right? Because again, some people might use truth and fact interchangeably, but maybe that distinction is really important. And so we might ask, well, you've told us what truth is. What's a fact on your view? It seems potentially impossible to define the fact to which a true statement is supposed to correspond without using the true statement itself, right? So the worry here is essentially that correspondence theorists are saying that truth is a fact and fact is a truth. But if we ask, well, where do we get that from? We can't just say facts come from truth and truth comes from facts, because that's circular reasoning, right? So some correspondence theorists respond to these accusations by claiming that fact means the same as actual state of affairs. However, it's unclear whether this really escapes the problem. But we should say, though, that lots of correspondence theorists have given answers to these criticisms, but we'll set those aside. But it's important to just keep in mind what some of these criticisms are so that we can think about them ourselves. Another problem is the problem of negative statements, right? So if we have a statement like no unicorns exist, well, what does that correspond to? Because if you're making a reference to something that doesn't even exist, what's the correspondence, right? How can you have a correspondence to a non-existent thing, right? Does it correspond to some negative state of affairs? You could also have a similar problem with hypothetical statements, like, things that if this were true, then this would happen. But if Anthony is the king of France, then Sophie is the queen of, some fictional place. I mean, what does that correspond to? Nothing, right? So that's something that correspondence theorists are going to have to account for. Okay, so definitely one of the more difficult views presented in the reading that I don't want to spend too much time on because it can get rather technical, and it's not really a very widely shared view, is what's called the semantic theory. And this is more of a successor to the correspondence theory. This is Alfred Tarski, so a little bit later than Bertrand Russell, 1902 to 1983. According to this view, talk of correspondence and facts is essentially eliminated, and instead we just need to look at language. So according to the semantic view, truth, whatever we mean by truth, is just ultimately tied up with language. There's no escaping it. Truth cannot be separated from language use. There's no truths or facts independent of language usage. It doesn't make sense to talk about truth out there or facts out there. We can only talk about truth when we compare it to the languages that are in use. So to see the semantic theory in use, consider the French phrase, la neige est blanche, which in English means snow is white. they express the same proposition. So according to Tarski, we would ask, under what conditions is that proposition true? Tarski argues that the proposition expressed by the English sentence, snow is white, is true if and only if snow is white. So it gives three conditions for any proposition to be considered true. The proposition expressed by the English or some other language sentence, snow is white, is true if and only if this is a relationship between the meaning of the proposition and what it aims to assert. And three, snow is white, the assertion. But notice here that this might sound a little confusing, but it's essentially just saying, according to some language, these things are true, right? That doesn't really, a lot of people might have a more intuitive notion of truth as being something bigger than that. It seems like to a lot of people, truth is something that is external to language, that there's actually truth out there. Some people don't think that's the case. Maybe you like the semantic view that truth can only be discussed relative to some language, right? And the conditions that the language gives for what truth is. That's really what the semantic theory is, talking about the meanings of words and the meaning of even the word truth. A lot of people, though, as I mentioned, find this view unmotivating. It seems to rely on a technical understanding of object and target languages, as you might have noticed in the reading, when truth seems to most to be a more intuitive concept that is language independent. And it seems to imply that truth cannot be divorced from language in any real tangible way. Maybe that's not a problem for you. Maybe you think, yeah, whatever we mean by truth, that's all it is. It's ultimately tied up with language. Great. There's ways to defend it, but a lot of people find this view unsatisfying. Okay, and the last view, that major view that we want to talk about, is coherence theory. So according to the coherence theory of truth, a belief is true if it coheres with other beliefs that we regard as true. So in other words, it's a holistic view of truth that talks about whether a belief or truth fits well with other beliefs or other views that you hold. So the essential test is not correspondence between a belief and fact in the real world, but coherence between a belief and other beliefs in one's mind. So in what way might geometry provide a useful illustration for the coherence theory of truth? There's a couple different ways we can do this. So here's an example. This is Brand Blanchard. He's a 20th century coherence theorist, and he defended coherence theory, was very interested in things like math. He pointed out that even someone using the correspondence theory would have to verify a statement such as, the table in the next room is round, by using other statements, beliefs, or judgments. So according to him, to discover a true proposition, even the correspondence theorist has to rely on its coherence with other statements, beliefs, or judgments, right? You would have to know that there is a next room, and that has to fit with things you already believe in. You have to already know what tables are, right? That has to cohere with what you already believe. So he's essentially saying that even correspondence theorists are really coherence theorists. Now, some people disagree with that, but the overall idea for coherence theory is, again, that it coheres with other beliefs that you already have. So he says, how should we test this judgment that the table is round? What verifies the statement of fact is the perceptual judgment that I make when I open the door and look at the table. But what verifies the perceptual judgment itself? A judgment of fact can be verified only by the sort of apprehension that can present us with a fact, and that this must be a further judgment. And an agreement between judgments is best described not as a correspondence, but as coherence. So to use this example, if I look at a table and I perceive a table in my office and it's round, well, how does that cohere with my beliefs about square tables or non-circular tables and circular tables, right? It has to cohere with things that I already believe, right? So he's really driving the point home that coherence theory is the best way to think about truth. We could also present this, as some people do, as ideal coherence. So in an ideally coherent system, all the beliefs that you have are in harmony with all the other beliefs in the system, and each belief supports or provides evidence for the other beliefs. Thus, any one belief could be deduced from the other beliefs, and the whole set of beliefs would be highly ordered, like the theorems that can be deduced from the axioms of geometry, for example. Right? So something like no proposition would be arbitrary, every proposition would be entailed by the others jointly and even singly, no proposition would stand outside the system. So maybe you think that's what truth is like, that it's really, they all derive from one ultimate truth, potentially. But a number of criticisms have been made of this view, of course. First, that it fails to distinguish between consistent truth and consistent error. So, for example, if we look at the history of science and we look at precursors to Copernicus, like Ptolemy, Ptolemy's theory was as consistent as that of Copernicus, yet we want to say only Copernicus's theory is true and gave us truths. Ptolemy's theory just wasn't true, even though Ptolemy's theory was perfectly consistent. That it seems in the end to rely on correspondence, right? So this is where the correspondence theorist is going to come in and say, yeah, coherence and consistency are nice, but Ptolemy was both coherent and consistent, but it didn't correspond with the way the planets really were. So Ptolemy, if you're unfamiliar with his views of astronomy, had very complex workings of the planets. He was a geocentrist, that the Earth is the center. And he had very elaborate systems of describing the motions of the planets. But, you know, in hindsight, we think, no, he got it wrong. It didn't correspond with the way the planets really were. So correspondence theorists are going to say Ptolemy's views didn't correspond with the facts, with the truth. So sorry, coherence theorists. If a judgment is coherent, it must cohere with another judgment. But what ensures that the truth of the initial judgments? What if our other judgments are mistaken, right? Is really another criticism that falls out of this. Maybe I'm a really coherent conspiracy theorist. Okay, so to bring this more into 2021, maybe I'm a really coherent and consistent conspiracy theorist, and I never contradict myself, and every belief that I have is perfectly consistent with the other. But a lot of people are going to say, yeah, Anthony, you know, we're really worried about you. We've been seeing your social media posts, and nothing you're saying is corresponding to reality, right? Just because you believe, you know, I don't know, in the QAnon theory, and it's perfectly consistent with itself, doesn't mean that that corresponds with reality. So a lot of people think, as well-intentioned as coherence theory is, people still have the intuition that what we think is true has to correspond with something in the external world. Okay, so that's a problem that they have to address. All right, and then the other major theory that we'll mention is the pragmatic theory. So pragmatic theory is really a more modern and certainly American view of truth. We get this in the 20th century from writers like William James, C.S. Peirce, and others, Dewey, a couple other writers that you might be familiar with. So, and it developed out of a dissatisfaction with, as I say, correspondence and coherence theories of truth. So it's led to this development. So the pragmatic theory of truth says that a belief is true if it works and is useful, for example, by letting us make accurate predictions. Tired of the rationalistic outlooks of European philosophy, they saw humans as needing to use the practical consequences of beliefs to decide truth and validity. So it might help us. When I say that the Earth is the third planet from, or let's take the simpler example, that the Earth is round. Why is that true? Well, consider the practical implications of the Earth being round. This is how we get satellites to work. This is how we get GPS to work. When we start talking about truth in that sense, a lot of our everyday interactions with the world depend on using some shared notion of the way things are, even if it turns out to change, right? We need to use the understanding that the Earth is round for all kinds of things, right? And so it just doesn't help us at all to try to think that the Earth is flat when clearly there's no good empirical grounds for doing so. So pragmatic theory says, look, we don't need to talk about it corresponding with reality. We don't need to talk about it cohering with other beliefs. Rather, we need to ask, well, what works? And clearly, science works. And what we mean by truth is really that a belief is true if it works and is useful. So the pragmatist introduces usefulness as the measure of truth and insists that we can define truth only in relation to consequences, as I mentioned. So again, a statement is true if people can use that statement to achieve results that satisfy their interests. This implies that there are no unchanging absolute truths. So this is going to be a major drawback for a lot of people. To verify a belief as truth, for example, we might look at whether it aids us individually or collectively in the biological struggle for survival. So this, I think, is a good way to capture it. So the people who claim that the earth is flat, I mean, that's not helpful, right? I mean, why are we trying to change the shape of the earth? Can people believe that? Yeah, but is it helpful? Does it have practical consequences for space travel or anything else that might depend on having a better understanding of the way space and astronomy works? No, right? Or take the hydrogen has one proton. A lot of our work in particle physics these days relies on certain understandings of atoms and electrons and protons. And so if you've got somebody who says hydrogen has 5 million protons, great. How does that help us? How does that change our understanding of hydrogen? What's the evidence for that, right? And then we can adjust as necessary. So this is one potential upshot of pragmatism, that there's no unchanging absolute truths, but a lot of people don't like that. They think, well, no, there are some truths that just are always true. They never change. Pragmatists deny that. So the pragmatic theory of truth has become a cornerstone of pragmatism itself. So I mentioned some of these names already. Peirce, James, John Dewey gave us a lot of insight into the pragmatic maxim and the theory of pragmatism. So nice little American shout out here to these writers. So this is William James, famous pragmatist. According to him, we do not base truth on a comparison of a statement with some objective external reality. Sorry, correspondence theorists. Neither is truth based on coherence with other beliefs. The essential problem with those outlooks is that their adherents have failed to ask the right questions. They shouldn't ask how judgments correspond or relate to reality, but what difference do they make? That's the right question we should be asking, according to James. So here's a quote from him. He says, "This thesis is what I have to defend. The truth of an idea is not a stagnant property inherent in it. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events. Its verity is in fact an event, a process, the process namely of its verifying itself, its verification. Its validity is the process of its validation." So when we discover the shape of the planet or other planets or the nature of hydrogen or whatever, we verify it, right? It becomes a process and then we start using it and then maybe that's going to change, right? It's not some immutable fixed thing. It's something that we work on and discover and verify and then continually doing that same process over and over again. There have been more modern contemporary pragmatists that might be worth pointing out here. Well, I don't think I put any names here, did I? No. So whereas James gave a definition of truth, modern pragmatists sometimes even go further than James and tend to argue that we should just forget about trying to define truth. Obviously, truth is just such a loaded term that if we're trying to give a nice and ready definition for it, we're always going to be disappointed. Instead, we should get on with the more important activity of living in open-minded democratic communities and working to see what's effective, right? And if we're trying to do armchair philosophy about what's true or what's truth, again, we're going to be continually disappointed. Instead, we have to act, and truth is going to be whatever works best for a community of open-minded, inquisitive thinkers. So, here's Richard Rorty, more recent philosopher. He has an interesting take on pragmatism. He claims that all that can be said about the notion of truth is that truth is whatever has passed society's procedures of justification. So he proposes what he calls the ethnocentric view, that there is nothing to be said about either truth or rationality apart from descriptions of the familiar procedures of justification which a given society, say ours, uses in one or another area of inquiries. So if we go back to science, we have certain procedures in science that we use and we think are quite effective. And that's where we get scientific truth, right? That are defined by the standards that science has found effective in the past, and which we think work well. And if we want to revise those standards to discover new things or new ways of understanding the universe, great, right? Whether it's dark matter or dark energy or something in biology or whatever, then we'll deal with it, right? Truth is isn't some fixed thing; it's continually evolving. So pragmatists such as Rorty argue that when people say something is true, they're really just commending it as good to believe, which implies it passes the test that our community uses to distinguish what is true from what is false. So interesting view. So are there problems with pragmatism? Sure. One criticism of pragmatism is that pragmatism seems unable to account for how beliefs we previously thought were true turn out to be false. So as I mentioned, at one time we thought that the earth was flat when it was in fact not flat, though some have maintained this false belief that the earth is flat, right? So pragmatism can account for how things go from being false to true. I think pragmatists have a response for that. But the criticism goes, for pragmatists, beliefs can be true and false depending on their respective communities. So some people accuse it of bordering on relativism, actually. Okay, so one reply to the previous criticism pragmatists have made, primarily from feminist epistemology, is that truth is what an ideal community would be justified in believing if it continued its investigations indefinitely, examined all evidence and all points of view and made no mistakes. So it's not like we'll ever become an ideal community, but just inquire about truths in the way that we would imagine an ideal community doing so, okay? One worry is that this move simply introduces us to another loaded conception. And the problem remains. How can we make sense of the claim to truth that pragmatists make for their own theory without collapsing into complete relativism? I still think that pragmatists can say, can respond to that, but it's certainly a worry that a lot of philosophers have pointed out about pragmatism. Okay, and wrapping up here, I know I'm going rather quickly, but there's a lot to cover. One question we might ask here near the end is, does truth matter? I mean, and I think we don't want to misunderstand the question, because I do think that inquiry matters, and intelligence and being open, those things are noble, and philosophy is certainly about that. So maybe a better rephrase of this question is, does the definition of truth matter, right? One might be tempted to say that it doesn't really matter whether one believes in the correspondence theory, the coherence theory, or the pragmatist theory. We might ask, well, what practical difference does it make? As I mentioned, these discussions really do have consequences that affect each of us, right? And if we live in a society where people really are occupying different worlds of truth and falsity, that could be really problematic, as we've seen in American society in the last few years. So we should take these issues seriously, right? And differing outcomes are going to depend on which theory we support. But if they produce different results as to what constitutes truth, then it does matter which theory you accept to determine what counts as reality and knowledge, right? So I definitely think that the question, does truth matter, is important, and it does have practical applications, but we might be dissatisfied with coming up with one nice and neat definition of truth that we can all agree to. Nonetheless, obviously, there are practical consequences to these discussions that do matter. Okay, and then lastly, many people think that look, science is really just going to figure this all out about what truth is and what's true about the world. Right? We're curing COVID-19, right? Putting people into space, creating media, all kinds of things. But again, all of the theories we just talked about, or that I just outlined, are different accounts of how science gives us truth or not. So some people think that correspondence theory is the best view of truth for science. Some people think that pragmatism is the best view to think of science. There's obviously disagreement. Some people think that science doesn't give us any truth. That's unfortunate, but right. So it's going to depend on which view you take, but certainly a lot more we could say there. Let me leave it there. I've already gone way over. Hopefully you enjoy thinking about truth and the various conceptions of truth. And as always, if you have any questions, please be sure to reach out to me. Thanks for listening.